And the firestorm that started in Middle America has now become a national story that could have a real impact on 2016. Yesterday, GOP hopefuls, including Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, backed the Indiana bill. This could be yet another culture war issue that plays well with the Republican base, but crushes the candidate nationally. For more on that, let's bring in John Stanton, Washington bureau chief for Buzzfeed News. John, always good to see you.
It's good to be here.
So if these governors did not have to make the changes in this bill, my guess is they wouldn't make these changes. But what we've seen play out in the past 3 days is, in some sense, what a democracy is all about. The American people pushing for change, demanding transparency and equality. If you take a step back, though, from all of this, John, is this about the power of democracy, or is this more about the power of big business?
Oh, I think a little bit of both. I think, the big business, if they had their druthers, I think would just get rid of these laws and maybe never even had them up in the first place. And I do think, it's kind of amazing that in Indiana, a state that I don't think anyone would have anticipated would have ever really considered legislation to protect LGBT people from discrimination, could very well end up with a law on the books explicitly stating that. And I think that is where you do see sort of the democratization of these processes sort of working. But certainly, I think businesses looked at this and were and thought this was a terrible thing for them. They didn't want to be a part of it. I mean, even for like Walmart, which, this is not so much about, people coming to Arkansas, but for just their stores in general around the country, and they just don't want to have to deal with this. And I think that's been an enormous pressure point for Republicans.
It is really interesting which laws spark a kind of backlash and force politicians to make a move, because Arkansas already has a law in the books that was put in place under this governor that, to my mind, is actually much worse. It makes it illegal for localities in Arkansas to protect LGBT citizens from discrimination. That is already on the books in Arkansas. So what was it about this particular situation that made Asa Hutchinson take a second look?
I think it was partly the fact that it seemed, certainly to the public at large, they were responding to the uproar over what was going on in Indiana. They sort of got caught under the coattails of that. I mean, there are a lot of states that have religious freedom laws of one form or another, and some of them are very similar to what Indiana and Arkansas are doing. And I think it's just that this is the kind of moment in time and history where people are saying, well, even if we've agreed to this before, we don't really agree with it anymore. We don't want to see this happen.
Do you think some of those laws that have already been passed, like that one I just referenced in Arkansas, do you think there'll be a re-examining of those as well?
I think in some places I would be surprised, frankly, if Arkansas goes back and say gets law. But I do think that there is an increasing number of people that are looking at this and saying we should just sort of have protections for people, and that it's not that bad of a thing, and making sure that people are not discriminated against is a laudable goal.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting parts is a lot of corporations like to say, not exactly true, but they like to say they stay out of politics. What they mean by that, of course, is they stay out of very divisive issues if they can help it and they don't need to make money off it. Here, this is sort of moved from traditional divisive politics to some notion of non-discrimination, inclusion, universal values, and that's why NCAA, Walmart, that's the way they've been talking about it. Governor Hutchinson, I thought, seemed to hit that point in a different way in invoking his son. Take a listen.
There is clearly a generational gap on this issue. My son, Seth, signed the petition asking me, Dad, the governor, to veto this bill.
Governor, some folks will look at that and say, well, this was a kind of a political move to invoke that. Others might see that very honestly, because I don't think he stage managed what his son asked him to do. That's a real thing. What did you make of it, and how useful is that as we have these conversations around the country? Because when you talk to young people in both parties, they are way past where these Republican dad governors are.
Yeah, it's funny. I think everybody of a certain, say, maybe under the age of 30, you start talking to these people, and almost universally, they look at this issue as something that they feel like should have been resolved a long time ago, and that we shouldn't be having these fights, frankly, at all. And I do think that's starting to have some pressure on older politicians. As far as the corporations, they look at that is a key demographic for them. They want to make a lot of money off of young people, but also the LGBT community has a lot of buying power in this country, and increasingly they have a lot of buying power. And I think those two forces come together and have made this sort of a no-brainer for a lot of the large, national corporations that have been putting the pressure on these governors.
No question. And John, as you know, this isn't the first governor dealing with this type of issue this week. Yesterday, Governor Mike Pence of Indiana facing a similar issue, and he sort of suggested that the media had blown this out of proportion and kind of misconstrued the real intention of the bill. Have a listen.
Can I just say this? I don't want to let the Indiana press off the hook here, but I will anyway. I think the Indiana press has had this right from early on, but some of the national reporting on this has been ridiculous.
John, I don't know if he's talking about you in particular or not. I'm not pointing any fingers, but let's talk about how the media should cover these types of stories. There's a school of thought, maybe Mike Pence believes this, that says that on these types of political issues, it should be, just reported. One side says this, the other side says this, and the reporter's kind of neutral. But when you get to issues of discrimination and those types of stories, is there a higher burden for reporters when they cover this to kind of call it like they see it?
Sure, absolutely, I agree. I think that, when you get into issues of human rights and civil rights, there is a much higher bar. And, the notion that there should be a he said, she said kind of reporting situation is not real, and it's never really been a very good model, frankly, I think, in any kind of instance in politics. Being able to say, this is what this person says, but this is the truth of the matter, or here are the facts as we know them, is much different than, well, they say it's not about this, and they say it's about that, and then leaving this big gap there for the reader that they don't know what is right and what is wrong. Right. And I think that that's, a problem, especially in these kind of instances.
Yeah, John Stanton.